Hi, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and I work in Southern Vermont.
My name is Robert Stack and I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor.
And once again, for people who would like to contact us, we have a Facebook page at www.facebook.com/letstalkvt, or our email site at letstalkaboutmentalhealth@gmail.com.
And tonight we got these wonderful cards and people's mailed into them, but we just want to make sure on the card we don't have the correct email. So the correct email is letstalkaboutmentalhealth@gmail.com. So if we made a mistake, and we apologize for anybody who's had trouble with that. So
yeah, we should mention these cards.
Yeah.
We always wanted to get calls, questions from viewers, and we realized that being a community television show and on once a week, that there wasn't really going to be a call-in show.
Right.
We figured that out after 2 seasons. So we developed these cards that are stamped and addressed for being sent back to us, and they have our address, our Facebook, and the Gmail account, and space to write your questions and mail them back to us. And you might find these around town here in Brattleboro. And I think, too, we've distributed them through the Recovery Network, the Vermont Recovery Network at the Turning Point Center. So, right, and there are 11 of those in the state. So we're starting to get some questions, and we're excited about that.
Very excited.
Yeah, very excited
This
about
was
that.
the idea, this was the hope. So why don't we start with the first one?
Sure. So this first one, my partner's been diagnosed with bipolar disease, ADHD, and Asperger's syndrome consistently by more than one practitioner. My partner does not acknowledge any of these diagnoses as accurate or as partial explanations for job losses and relationship failures and struggles. Do you have any suggestions for how to lead a horse to water so positive change and some self-care might result?
Right.
There are a lot of things to address in this, right? Primarily, it sounds like, I'm going to imagine, well, he or she, I don't know, but the partner who's writing this question feels like these are accurate descriptions of the struggles of the partner. And I mean, often, especially with, the DSM being a rather, I say, imprecise, manual, it has a lot of overlap between various disorders. It can be hard sometimes with somebody with Asperger's or bipolar ADHD to tell which symptoms are what, which disorder might this be, how to tease this out as 3 separate disorders. But I think for the question, though, given that it's been diagnosed by more than one practitioner, we should probably assume there's an accuracy to these diagnoses.
Right. But the issue really that she's talking to is that the person that we're talking about, or that she's talking about, doesn't accept the diagnosis.
Right.
And that, and one of the, she says lead them to the water, lead the horse to water. Well, the trick is to get the horse to drink it, and
right.
not to, And as you know, I talk a lot about the stages of change. And so one of the problems there, looks like, to me anyway, is that for whatever reason, her partner feels to accept those diagnoses is to acknowledge something that he doesn't want to acknowledge. And my guess is that he knows that if he acknowledges they're accurate, then he needs to change something. And he's not ready to change anything. Yeah. I mean, so it's like, in my experience, somebody knows enough to say that if I'm an alcoholic, then I shouldn't drink. But if I'm just a heavy drinker, or I'd avoid the label, then I don't have to change anything.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think one of the things that we know, some of the research seems to indicate, is that if you try and get somebody to accept something they don't want and try to get them to take action they don't want to take, right, what you end up getting is resistance.
Right.
And I think that's what that question is really speaking to.
Because that's important. I mean, when people started to take some responsibility for their wellness, one of the things that's been important when you talk about a diagnosis is that it resonates with them. They're like, oh, you know what, that makes sense. That really explains things for me. And it seems that when that happens, that's the point where people start to really engage with people around the treatment. I would wonder, so obviously there's not the resonating with this person here.
Right.
And like you're saying, what's the reason for that resonating? Either they're inaccurate diagnoses or the meaning of them is not something that he's ready to hear right now.
Right.
Right.
And you know, I read this interesting article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, a book review, and they were talking about ADHD being evolutionary in that it was the hunter-gatherer
Right.
that developed this ADHD.
You wanted somebody who was looking around all over
That's right,
the place.
always
yeah.
on the alert. And you know, you think about Vermont and hunting, this guy might be a great hunter. I mean, he may not think, you know, I don't have ADHD, you know, I'm just interested.
I just don't like school.
I don't like school or whatever. But I think the issue is really more, I guess my suggestion, if I was talking to her one-to-one, would be to stop using the labels. That for whatever reason, those labels aren't helping.
Yeah, that's not working.
And it's not working, so why don't you leave that alone? But if there are struggles and there are things that are going wrong, see if you can talk about that.
Yeah.
And I got that little bit about self-care. Does that mean that she feels obligated to take care of him? You know,
Right.
is there some aspect of that?
Which
that
again might be counterproductive because, as we've often seen, is if everything's okay, you don't want to change anything. So if I'm able to sit home all day and I get fed and I get a little bit of spending money, what's the impetus for me to leave the house and go to work? So it might be that things are working well enough for him, or you know, good enough for government work, as the expression is, and that he doesn't have that impetus to change. And as you're saying, maybe take care of yourself, right? Family therapy alone, even. Individual therapy to then examine sort of how you look at this and what you could possibly do. And take care of yourself first.
And you know, you could even use some Al-Anon or you know that idea.
Yeah.
You know, listen, I care about you, I love you, but I'm not picking up after you.
Right. Yeah.
You know, or I'm not going to. You know, if you make a mistake or something sort of goes wrong, you know, you'll have to take care of it. And I don't know that, and I'm just sort of guessing. So,
Yeah.
But when she says I would like a little more self-care, I get that impression. What she's saying is I'd like to do a little less of this. You know what I
Right.
mean? I would like him to take care of himself. And I acknowledge that. I agree with that.
Yeah.
He probably should. But I'm not sure how that would work out. How to approach it, I think, would be more like not telling him how to change, but for her to say, this is how I'm going to change.
Right. Yeah.
This is what I'm going to do different.
Yeah.
And then, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. I mean, if she starts taking care of herself and not necessarily of him, sometimes people get scared because they're not sure what the outcome will be.
Right.
Oh my God, if I don't get his meds, he won't get his meds. Or if
Right.
I don't do this, you know. I can't judge that risk factor,
Yeah.
but
But,
it
you know,
sounds like that.
We know not every relationship lasts forever, and but I mean, but relationships. She didn't let me finish. But relationships that do last, they go through changes.
All
Each
right.
partner evolves to be able to allow the relationship to live on a long time.
Okay, so we're not
That's
suggesting
yeah.
that she.
Hey, I've been in some relationships that haven't lasted and some that have. So again, wish you well, but there's definitely, I mean, there's a great tension here that really has to
Right.
be. It is not going to be able to exist forever.
And the old thing that counselors, one of the things I learned, you know, when you run into resistance, it's not the other person's fault. When you run into resistance as a counselor, you're coming at it the wrong way.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're looking for an argument. You're going to get into an argument, or you're going to, you know. And so I don't saying that everybody needs to be a counselor, but I think it's a good way of thinking about it. If I'm running into resistance, then it may be a matter of technique, and maybe I'm approaching this problem in the wrong way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but anyway,
Okay.
go ahead.
Great. So this next question is, my children's father has bipolar diagnosis, and we think his father had undiagnosed bipolar, self-medicated with alcohol. What is the likelihood that my kids have bipolar also? I haven't seen mood swings or violence in my kids, but there has been a really strong insistence on I'm right, often with the one kid.
Is it genetic?
I mean, we certainly think so, right? I mean, most of the disorders we talk about, the idea of nature versus nurture, and realize that there's a component for both of those. And certainly we think that, addiction, we call the affective disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, that they do have a hereditary component to it. So on the one hand, that's a possibility. And then two, but say carrying hereditary illness doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to develop, right? You can have the risk without actually having the event occur. I'd be curious too. I mean, bipolar disorder, it's it's such an inexact diagnosis these days, right? I mean, classically, someone with bipolar disorder would have what was called mania, and they would not need to sleep for days or weeks at a time. They would have, what they call grandiosity, this sense of great importance, either their ideas or that they were, even as far as being a prophet, for example. This energy to do, hundreds of things at a time. And speech that comes out so fast that you can't even interrupt it, like a fire hydrant of words. And so, I mean, if that's when I talk about, sort of more a genetic component. But then too, I mean, bipolar disorder has been diagnosed in people who are just plain hard to get along with. They're irritable, they're reactive, and that's not really the idea. So a lot of sort of research camps have broaden the application of the diagnosis of bipolar to be a bipolar type 1, being the one I just described with the true mania, to a bipolar type 2, which is sort of a lower simmering level of bipolar, and then even bipolar type 3, childhood bipolar, is it something different or a precursor to adult bipolar? So I'm curious about that diagnosis and how accurate it might be, especially when I hear about sort of self-medicating with alcohol.
Well, that's the grandfather, and that's what got my attention when I saw that. First of all, it's in hindsight, and you're saying, I think your grandfather or your father was just like that too,
because he was a difficult guy.
Yeah, and the whole idea that it's self-medication, and so sometimes you'll hear that people are assuming, well, the illness was there, and they took the alcohol to deal with the illness. And personally, I really, as you know, dislike that term.
Me too.
Because it's not medicine. I don't believe it's self-medication. I do believe you might have both problems. You might have alcoholism. You might have bipolar disease. But I don't know enough about this, but she mentions it as if it's going to prove the argument of genetics. In other words, and maybe so. Like you said, grandfather has it, the father has it. Is there a risk factor for the children to have it? Probably. But I would go back to that grandfather. I wouldn't be that so sure about that. I wouldn't, automatically say, in hindsight, here's the diagnosis that I think the grandfather. Did he have periods of mania? I mean, do you really want to talk about mania? I mean,
was he ever hospitalized or arrested for his bipolar disorder?
Was he on lithium? Or, how did you assume that he was on? Did he commit suicide? I mean, what was his depression? How long did they? So, I mean, in hindsight, you look over a lifetime of somebody and say, well, he was really up and he was really down or whatever, But until I hear he, bought a boat and, he doesn't know how to swim. I mean,
those sorts of impulsive things.
Yeah, really mania type things. I wonder about it. And again, that idea in which he's talking about the dual disorder aspect of it, talking about the drinking and, this is what your self-medication of my father, he did this. So, more than anything, I guess if there's something to come from this question or from this woman's concern, is that if there's the possibility that he truly does have inherited some mental illness, then I guess I would talk about it. And I used to encourage people to talk about alcoholism if it ran in the family. And I would say to a young person, you have a risk factor. Your father had alcoholism, your grandfather had alcoholism, and if there's any truth at all to genetic studies, and there are some fairly good genetic studies done, especially around adoption, the children from an alcoholic family, parents were adopted by non-alcoholic.
By sober folks,
And yet their children that were adopted from alcoholic parents were more likely to become alcoholics than other adopted children from non-alcoholic parents. That's the study that comes to mind.
That's the proof of the genetic component.
Yeah, a little bit. So, but if that is true, then one of the things you'd want to do is sort of talk about it, but not in a shaming way. You know what I mean? Not yelling, not saying you're just like your father, just like, because that's not going to. But over time, if you have an opportunity to talk about, well, there's certain behaviors and there's certain things that we need to be aware of. And you need to understand that, it may run in this family. You may need to get therapy or see a doctor, or we may even have to use some medication. But I wouldn't. I'm a little bit afraid that this is sort of like, you're going to be just like, and it'll be more of that, I'm not like him, as we all know.
Yeah.
If I've ever talked to anybody who's a son of an alcoholic, I mean, the first thing they say is, I wasn't going to be like him. I didn't like him. I didn't like, what he did and stuff. And so sometimes saying, you know, well, you're going to be like your grandfather, you're going to be like your father. Sometimes that's really not helpful.
Yeah.
But if you can talk about it in a sort of, I wouldn't say non-judgmental, but at least in a non-shaming way, and say, everybody struggles, and we all have, like you say, certain characteristics and certain things, but you should be aware of this, and we should keep an eye on this. And by all means, and I hope you don't mind, but I would always say to somebody who thinks they're at risk for depression or any other mental illness, please don't use substances.
Right, because contrary, they're medicating, making things better. We know that with depression and bipolar disorder, the use of drugs seems to really be a factor in worsening the episodes of the mania or the depression. So certainly not, it's like putting gas on the fire as opposed to being a medication to help contain it.
Now again, this is just a postcard, and so there might be other symptoms other than just saying,
But I like, and again, this child's behavior. One of the issues we see with schools and ADHD, for example, like you were saying, that shifting attention very frequently that we call ADHD. Actually has survival benefits if you talk about sort of a wilder lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And it could very well be that the classroom environment, in rows, eyes front, is not the environment for this child to thrive. So now maybe get involved with a school, seek out counseling. It might be this sort of I'm right is actually a very positive trait for this young this kid to have that could lead to great success if it's channeled early on.
And this, believe it or not, this is a very common thing for people to believe that whatever they're thinking is right.
We can do it,
No, really, it's taken me years to accept the thing that maybe what I think about something is wrong. And that is like a major step forward in mental health for me. I mean, because you tend to, if you come to like a conclusion, as far as you're concerned, an informed conclusion, of course you're right. Right. I mean, you very rarely ever say to yourself, I'm probably wrong. Occasionally you hear somebody say, I'm probably wrong about this, but this is what I think.
This might be a good thing.
It's part of growing up sometimes, is to come to the realization that what you think instinctively might not be right.
Might not be the prevailing opinion.
It might not be the right thing to do. And I think that's hard. When you're a kid, I mean, you're sort of like, you just think, whatever I think, that's what it is.
But as part of it, I have my worldview, and then I make other things fit. I make other things fit until finally there's so many things that don't fit that I then need to accommodate to what everybody, what other people are thinking.
I remember when I was parenting, I used to think, maybe what I need to do is say the opposite of what I want. This is when it gets tricky,
Well, that and maybe then some good sage advice would help this parent to raise that child in a good direction.
I don't know. I can't do that.
All right. So then we got to get through these, Robert.
Okay,
Although we could spend all day on so many of these. My partner says he stopped looking at inappropriate websites and only plays computer games, semi-violent ones. Can I believe him when he says he stopped, even though he isn't in any kind of therapy or group now? He has ADD, inattentive, and Asperger's, and says computer games help him focus. There's an issue of trust here.
Yeah.
Whether he's actually changed or not. I mean, one point, people do change without professional intervention. I mean, one of the thoughts is that most people manage to change things they want to change, to stop drinking or to pick up healthy habits without ever seeking professional help. So it is a possibility that he has, but there's something going on here where she does not trust that he's actually made these changes.
Well, she doesn't like the inappropriate, and I presume it's sexual.
I'm guessing porn sites, right? Wouldn't you think that?
If porn's like a click away, for some people it becomes almost irresistible. Right. Just human nature, curiosity, whatever. I mean, and if he says he's cut back on her or he's cut down, I would support it. And like you're saying, unless you're checking on him and everything. But I think the other question was really his claim that it helps him focus. Now, again, I don't want to get into arguing with people about what they do with their life. You know what I mean? If he wants to stand and play computer games, who am I to say? You know what I mean? Well, you can't watch computer games,
Yeah.
You need to watch sports. I mean, no.
Or when they're going to get a job.
It's a judgment thing. But I will say, I mean, I was reading about this recently that a lot of the computer games, and she says semi-violent. Right. Some of them are very violent. And I don't know what semi means, but violence is violence. Yeah. And also, many of them are sort of, I mean, they're horrible toward women. They treat women as objects. I mean, there's an awful lot of it. I mean, and I was reading somewhere where one woman has sort of made it a point to speak out against it. And she was sort of saying, this is really, this is unhealthy. This is we have a whole generation of people who are watching these games, and they're really, not only are they violent, but they're really misogynistically. Right. I mean, they're just, hostile to women. And so, and I don't mean to go off on that. I mean, separately from what she's asking about. But I just, in general, I mean, I can see her concern about, and like you said, he says it helps him focus. And I remember hearing that sometimes. I used to have people in my group, and they used to say if they were distracted, they sometimes could do some other activity that helped them focus on what someone was saying.
Like a lot of times knitting, I think a lot of people have used, or even holding sort of a worry stone is often a technique that people with ADHD will use, because having that other sort of physical piece going on allows that focus and concentration to be improved.
Right, but watching the video game does not help him focus in other activities. That's what I'm trying to get.
I mean, I would guess that he's just focusing better on the screen.
What he wants to see,
I'm not distracted because it shifts very quickly, these games, and it's exciting and it's interesting, and it's almost like, well, so what if you're focusing better on video games? Like anything, I mean, it's not, again, he's focusing better on video games. Is that productive? Is that what's causing the stress here? The fact that he's found something he can concentrate on, is that by itself worthwhile?
Now, I will say, and I don't know enough about it, and I never worked enough with it around Asperger's, and people saying that they were better in certain not in social situations. And I did read somewhere where they were using computers for people with Asperger's for communication. I may be wrong about that.
I can see. I mean, we're talking about what's called sort of it sounds like what she's hitting on is something called a process addiction. It's not to a substance like alcohol or tobacco or marijuana or opiates, but rather to a thing. So when people talk about a gambling addiction or an internet addiction, they're talking about a process addiction versus a substance addiction, and there's still some controversy over whether those actually count as addictions or not, since they don't respond to medications in the same way, they don't respond to treatments in the same way. So that could be part of it. But I mean, Asperger's, like you were saying, these are people that are in what's is now called an autistic spectrum disorder, but used to be called persistent developmental delay, that they are having difficulty socially with communication, with interpreting cues as well. And who knows? It might just be that this is a world he feels he can navigate, whereas the idea of being with people with their sort of people with Asperger's have very narrow interests that other people aren't interested in, not picking up that I'm not interested in what you're saying or we need to shift the topic, makes social situations often very difficult for people with Asperger's or other autistic disorders. And it's very, training around that really has about sort of noticing, picking out various pieces of social interactions so they can at least mimic those things and learn how to communicate and socialize better with other people.
If this says my partner, so I presume these are adults and these are equals within an adult relationship. And if you're a parent or you're in a parental role, and you can talk about restricting access, cutting back on time, or locking out programs, or whatever other thing you want to do as a parent. But I mean, as a partner, as an equal partner, I would take more of that approach about, is there other things that we can do together? Because I think part of this is that this partner is not involved with each other.
Right.
It's more with the screen and stuff. And so, again, I don't know enough about that. It could be a family issue, couples counseling, something like that. But I'm not sure about how much you can tell somebody not to watch that, not to do that.
Okay, like we said previously, you must have to make some choices about what is your role in this kind of relationship going to be, and do you change together, do you change separately? But meeting resistance if you go straight for, don't do this or.
Right, and it sounds kind of resentful, like you're spending all that time, and I don't know, what are you watching, and what are you doing on there, and they're violent, and that could be upsetting. I mean, it could be very upsetting, but I don't know if that's going to get that person to change. I don't know if that's helpful.
It's a hard call, yeah.
So this one here, we'll talk about this a little bit earlier. Why can't we get more long-term rehab facilities? And then they go on to say, like Maple Leaf.
Right, okay. Yeah, I can see there could be a number of ways to answer this question, or even to understand where the question's coming from. I work at I work at Serenity House, which is a different residential treatment center. And in Vermont, we have three. There's Maple Leaf Farm, Serenity House, and Valley Vista. And there are chronically wait lists at any of these places. If you're lucky, you might get in a day or two. When things are, say, very busy, then it can take a week or a couple of weeks. When they've been talking about developing a network throughout the state, and they say, it's when you say you're ready to get into treatment, we want treatment to be available for you. Mm-hmm. We need to strike while the urge, the desire is still there. So I'd wonder about that, but then I think too about what's going on in the state of Vermont in general, and particularly, we're talking about addiction and trying to develop a fuller spectrum of care. So I think one of the things we see is that while hospitalization is almost always overkill as far as, say, a 5-day hospital stay for withdrawal or detox treatment, residential treatment centers offer 2 to 3 weeks of treatment, which could be then detox as well as then you're ready to then sort of assimilate the concepts of wellness and the 12 steps and possible medication approaches. How does your mood and anxiety fit in that as well? But we know that for long-term care, there needs to be long-term outpatient therapy, which again, like methadone clinics or community mental health centers, or Otter Creek, which is here, which is important because there has to be persistence in this. Short, high-resource treatments are not as effective in the long run as persistent effort can be, right?
Right. And just to say, she uses long-term, and I remember that back in the day when we used to send opiate addicts, before we had Suboxone or methadone, we used to send opiate addicts over to New Hampshire. And there was a place that used to keep people for a year, sometimes up to 6 months. And that was more about personality change. That was more about teaching people the rules, tear down their defenses, rebuild the person, change that thing. The other thing I'll say that, like Maple Leaf and many of these places, there isn't a lot of evidence that it promotes abstinence. I mean,
Right.
One of the things that killed the 28-day program was people going back and drinking right after they left the 28-day
Right.
program. Because it's a tremendous education, and it does wonders for people. And I think there's a great benefit to learning the terms, introducing to 12-step programs, understanding about the harm that you're causing your family or yourself, a moment to get sober under medical care, to be reflective. So I think there's a lot of benefits to it. But the reality is that you go back to where you were.
Right.
And so some people can excel in a treatment center and do well in a treatment center in that type of environment. But does it carry over to when they go back home, till they go back to their other environment?
Right.
And so I think that's where you have to sort of take a look at what is the purpose of the long-term treatment. What are what are you hoping to achieve, and what are the resources that might be available when you leave or not leave?
Right. I think sometimes these short-term, high-resource treatments are really tied into the older notions of a cure.
Right.
And realize, let's fix this now and do something big, when it's really consistent, persistent effort that's going to be necessary to change.
Well, listen, we love these cards. We hope you enjoyed this show. And if you could just send us more questions, we'll answer them. Anyway, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Good night. Thank you.